Welcome to episode 8 of the MBT podcast. In the previous episode, we discussed session 6, titled Attachment and Mentalizing. In this episode, we will continue with session 7. And, as we transition into the core focus of today's deep dive, we're really tackling something that I think is just incredibly misunderstood.
Oh, absolutely. It's wildly misunderstood.
Right. So we are pulling directly from the publications on MBT to unpack what a personality disorder actually is, the very hopeful realities of living with one, and we're going to take a specific, highly nuanced look at borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Yeah, and it's a topic that carries just immense weight. There's a profound amount of historical baggage and, unfortunately, so much stigma attached to it.
So much stigma.
Exactly. The cultural narrative surrounding personality disorders, particularly BPD, has been largely defined by, caricatures and fear. And our goal today is to really dismantle that.
Yes, exactly. And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right from the start. Whether you're studying this material for your profession, or maybe you're trying to desperately understand a loved one who seems caught in this cycle of chaos.
Right. Or even if you're applying these concepts to yourself.
Exactly. Or if you're just deeply curious about the extremes of human psychology. Our mission today is to take these dense clinical concepts and break them completely down. We want to put them into relatable human terms.
Because we aren't here to read a textbook at you.
No, definitely not. We are here to figure out what it actually feels like, biologically and emotionally, to navigate the world with these specific traits.
And if I can offer a thought to kind of anchor us before we really dive into the mechanisms, what's fascinating here is that the publications on MBT explicitly tell us that one of the most pervasive ideas in popular culture is entirely false.
Oh, this is the part that blew my mind.
Right. The concept of the borderliner, this monolithic, identical profile of a highly volatile, manipulative person who behaves in exactly one specific way, is an absolute myth. It simply does not exist.
Wow.
Furthermore, the very idea of a personality disorder is far more malleable, flexible, and responsive to time and treatment than society, and sometimes even the medical establishment would have you.
Okay, let's unpack this right away, because that is a massive paradigm shift. Just hearing the word disorder, it makes it sound permanent.
It does. It sounds fatalistic.
It sounds like a life sentence. It sounds like something is fundamentally irreparably broken at the core of your being.
Mm-hmm.
But the publications on MBT lay out a very specific foundational definition that we really need to start with to ground our understanding.
Yes, the definition of what a trait actually is.
Right. They state that a personality disorder involves long-standing personality traits, and they define traits as specific ways of thinking, feeling, behaving, and interacting with others. The absolute key here is that these specific ways of operating cause significant pervasive distress across various situations.
That's the crucial part, pervasive distress.
Yeah. It's not just having a bad mood on a Tuesday, right? It's a pervasive, unyielding pattern.
Exactly. And to really understand that, we have to look at what a trait is in a normal context. Everyone listening to this has a unique constellation of personality traits. Some of us are naturally introverted, preferring quiet environments to recharge.
Right, like I need my quiet time after a long week.
Right, and some are highly organized and conscientious, needing a clean desk to think clearly. Some are spontaneous. These are just normal human variations. But a trait crosses the invisible line into what clinical psychology calls a disorder, when two things happen.
Okay, what are those two things?
It becomes entirely rigid and it becomes profoundly maladaptive.
Meaning, you can't turn it off, even when it's actively hurting you.
Precisely. If your organized trait is so rigid that you have a full-blown panic attack because someone moved your stapler and you literally cannot function for the rest of the day well, that trait has become maladaptive.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Yeah. And the publications on MBT highlight that when these traits become rigid like that, they create severe grinding friction in 4 main arenas of a person's life.
Let's really walk through those 4 arenas, because I think this is where the clinical jargon kind of drops away and it gets very real for people. Let's paint a picture of what this friction actually looks like in daily life.
Well, the first arena is how we deal with ourselves. This is your internal landscape, your private dialogue.
The voice in your head.
Exactly. And for someone with a personality disorder, that internal landscape is often an incredibly harsh, unforgiving place. It is characterized by a heavily negative self-image and profoundly low self-esteem.
Man, that's tough to even think about.
Imagine waking up every single day with an internal narrator that only points out your flaws, your failures, and your fundamental unworthiness. It colors every single thought before you even get out of bed.
That sounds absolutely exhausting. So you're already starting the day with zero internal resources,
Basically zero, yes.
and then you have to go interact with the world, which brings us to the second arena, right? Romantic and platonic relationships. If your internal narrator is telling you that you're worthless, how does that bleed into a marriage or a friendship?
It creates a state of constant high alert vigilance. The rigid traits create constant misunderstandings. You might misinterpret a tired sigh from your partner as a definitive sign of impending rejection.
Like they're just tired from work, but you think they hate you.
Yes. And this leads to intense volatility arguments that escalate from 0 to 100 in seconds. Or, conversely, a deep inability to connect at all, where the person builds massive emotional walls to avoid the pain of the rejection they feel is just inevitable.
Okay, so the internal world's a war zone, the home life is a minefield. What is the third arena?
The third is functioning at work or at school. This is the professional sphere. The friction here could look like an intense inability to handle constructive feedback from a boss.
Oh, I can see how that goes wrong.
Right, because instead of hearing, could you format this report differently next time? The rigid trait processes it as, you are a complete failure and you are about to be fired.
So the stakes were always at maximum.
Always. And this leads to chronic conflicts with colleagues, sudden job quitting, or severe burnout from just overcompensating constantly.
So there is quite literally no safe harbor. Not inside your own head, not with your partner, not at work. And the fourth arena.
The fourth is family dynamics, which is often where the deepest, most complex friction occurs. This is because our family of origin is usually where our earliest attachment patterns were formed.
The roots of the tree, basically.
Exactly. The triggers here are ancient and deep-rooted. A casual comment from a parent at Thanksgiving can activate decades of unresolved psychological defenses. And when you combine the friction in all four of these areas, the self, the partner, the workplace, the family, the sheer caloric and emotional energy required just to exist is staggering. And that exhaustion feeds right back into that deeply negative self-image we mentioned in the first arena.
It becomes a self-sustaining loop of suffering.
That's exactly what it is.
Wait, let me make sure I'm really understanding this, because I want to push back a little on how we frame this loop of suffering. Because, when someone hears the term personality disorder, they don't hear, I have friction in four arenas.
I know, they don't.
They hear, my personality is disordered. They hear, I am fundamentally broken down to my soul. But the publications on MBT make what I think is the most crucial, life-saving distinction in the entire framework.
Yes, they do.
They say that having a personality disorder does not mean your entire personality is problematic. It's just certain specific traits.
That is precisely what the framework emphasizes, and it is a distinction that is often completely lost in clinical diagnoses, unfortunately.
Okay, so I was thinking about this, and I want to try an analogy on you to see if it holds up clinically.
Let's hear it.
Imagine your mind, your essence, is a high-end smartphone. The hardware is beautiful, the screen is crystal clear, the camera takes amazing photos. The core operating system, the very essence of who you are, your unique sense of humor, your profound capacity for kindness, your intellect, your creativity, all of that is perfectly good. It is pristine.
I'm following you.
But somewhere along the line, you had a few specific apps installed that have deeply corrupted code. Let's call them the emotional regulation app or the relationship manager app. When you tap on those specific apps, they glitch. They crash the system.
Right.
They freeze the screen. They drain your battery down to 1% by noon, making the phone incredibly hot to the touch. Now, the phone isn't garbage. The phone is a highly valuable, brilliant piece of technology. You just have a few localized apps with bad code that are aggressively hoarding the system's resources and wreaking havoc on your daily usage.
It's a very compelling analogy, and I think it's a deeply compassionate way to visualize it.
Yeah.
However, I want to challenge it just slightly to make it perfectly align with the clinical reality.
Okay, where does it break down?
The danger with the smartphone analogy is that on a phone, if an app is crashing, you just hold your finger on it and hit uninstall. It takes 2 seconds.
Oh, right. Yeah, human brains don't work like that.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
With human neurology, those apps, those neural pathways governing emotional regulation and interpersonal connection are deeply woven into the hardware itself. You can't just delete them. You have to painstakingly rewrite the code of the app while the phone is actively running.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It's like trying to change the tires on a car while you are driving down the highway at 60 miles an hour.
Oh, wow. Okay. That is a crucial distinction. It validates why the process of healing is so incredibly difficult and exhausting, but it still protects the core truth, right? The car isn't garbage. The phone isn't broken.
Exactly. And that is why this distinction matters so profoundly for your mental framework. If you think the phone is broken, if you think you are fundamentally entirely flawed at your core, the natural, logical, emotional response is despair.
It's hopelessness. Yeah.
Exactly. Why bother trying to change if the core material is rotten? But if you realize, my operating system is good, my hardware is valuable, I just have a few crashing apps that need to be carefully reprogrammed, it shifts the perspective entirely.
It moves you from a state of, I am fundamentally broken, to a state of, I have specific identifiable traits that are currently malfunctioning and need active managing and updating.
Yes. And that leads us perfectly into the next major revelation from the publications on MBT, the myth of the unchangeable diagnosis.
This is huge. Because for a very long time, decades, really the cultural and even psychiatric narrative was that if you had a personality disorder, that was just it. Game
Yeah.
over.
Sadly, yes. That was the prevailing attitude.
You were stamped with a label, put in a specific box, and the goal was basically just to heavily medicate you to keep you quiet. But the framework we are looking at makes a deeply encouraging, scientifically backed point. While these disorders can exist for a long time, they are not chronic, and they are not unchangeable.
This raises an incredibly important question about how we view psychological healing versus physical healing, and where the medical model sometimes fails us.
How so?
Well, in physical medicine, the word chronic often implies a lifelong, relentless management of a deteriorating condition. Think of chronic kidney disease or chronic heart failure.
Right, things that generally don't reverse themselves.
Exactly. But in psychology, particularly with personality disorders, we are dealing with the brain. And the brain is famously plastic. It has neuroplasticity. It physically changes its structure based on experience and learning. The text points out something fascinating here. There is a natural, observable mellowing effect that occurs with personality disorders over time.
A mellowing effect. Let me guess, is this like aging a fine wine where the tannins just naturally soften? Or is it more like you just get too exhausted in your 40s and 50s to keep up the high-octane drama of your 20s?
It is actually a fascinating combination of both biology and behavioral fatigue. Let's look at the biology first. As people age, neurological maturation continues long past adolescence.
Even into adulthood.
Yes, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that sits right behind your forehead and governs impulse control, long-term planning, and emotional regulation, it continues to strengthen its connections. So, your biological brakes naturally get a bit stronger as the decades pass.
So the hardware naturally upgrades itself over time.
Yes, exactly. But the behavioral aspect is equally important. People simply gain life experience. Through decades of painful trial and error, people naturally learn different, slightly better ways to cope with the things that trigger them.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure, they might learn that sending that furious text message at 2 a.m. always ruins their week. Always. So over time, they develop a habit of putting their phone in another room at night. The sharpest, most destructive edges of the maladaptive traits naturally begin to sand themselves down as the decades pass. The intensity of the internal fire naturally dims.
That is so incredibly hopeful for anyone listening who feels like they are currently burning alive in that fire. But I know there's a caveat here. The text also heavily emphasizes the flip side of this natural mellowing the environmental triggers, the stress amplifier.
Yes, the stress amplifier is a very real factor.
I want to push on this because isn't everyone stressed? How does stress uniquely interact with these specific personality traits? Because from what I'm reading, it's not a straight, gentle, upward line of improvement.
It is definitely not a straight line. It is a jagged, highly reactive line. The publications on MBT contrast periods of calm with periods of high stress to explain this. Think of stress as a master volume knob for those crashing apps you mentioned earlier.
Okay, let's look at the biology of that volume knob. What is actually happening in the brain?
When a human being experiences a major life stressor, a devastating romantic breakup, losing a job, experiencing a death in the family, or even moving to a new city, the brain perceives a threat to survival.
It goes into fight or flight.
Precisely. The internal system is instantly flooded with stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline. Now, what cortisol does is it prioritizes immediate survival over complex thought. It literally narrows your psychological bandwidth.
So it shuts down the smart part of the brain.
Yes. It temporarily impairs that prefrontal cortex we just talked about, the logical regulating part of the brain, and hands full control over to the amygdala, which is the primitive emotional threat detection center.
So if I don't have a personality disorder and I go through a bad breakup, my brain gets flooded with cortisol, I cry, I eat a lot of ice cream, I might act a little irrationally for a few weeks, but eventually my prefrontal cortex comes back online and I process the grief.
Correct. Your baseline emotional regulation system is strong enough to absorb the cortisol flood and eventually stabilize. But for someone with a personality disorder, their emotional regulation system, that specific app, is already glitching on a good day.
Oh, I see.
When you introduce a massive flood of cortisol from a breakup into that system, it causes a total system overload. The symptoms of the personality disorder will noticeably violently spike. The apps don't just crash, they shut down the whole phone. The individual might engage in extreme impulsivity, severe self-harm, or intense paranoia.
That makes total sense. The environmental trigger acts as a massive amplifier for the underlying pre-existing vulnerability. But to keep us on the hopeful track, the text also notes the exact reverse of this dynamic, right?
It does. Just as high stress amplifies the traits, periods that are stable, routine, predictable, and calm lead to a very noticeable decrease in symptoms. When the environment is safe, the cortisol levels drop, the prefrontal cortex comes back online, and the volume knob gets turned way down. The individual can function beautifully.
And this brings us to the active role of treatment. We aren't just waiting around for the decades to pass or hoping for a perfectly stress-free life, which doesn't exist, by the way.
No, it certainly doesn't.
The publications on MBT are very, very clear about this. Good, targeted treatment actively helps. It is not a placebo. It helps individuals suffer less from the specific patterns and traits that hinder them. For you listening right now, if you are struggling with these chaotic internal storms, the message here is that change isn't just a nice, comforting idea on a poster. It is a scientifically backed, clinically observable reality.
Absolutely.
Treatment is the active, deliberate process of learning how to rewrite the code for those glitchy apps while the phone is running.
And that concept of rewriting the code is the perfect bridge into understanding why the apps have glitchy code to begin with. Because in mentalization-based treatment, knowledge is most valuable when it is deeply understood and applied. We cannot change the pattern until we understand the origin.
Right, you have to find the root cause.
Exactly. So we need to ask, how does a human being actually develop these specific maladaptive traits? Why does one person get a glitchy emotional regulation app and another person gets a perfectly functioning one?
Okay, let's really unpack this. We are looking at the foundational recipe for a personality disorder. This is the classic age-old nature versus nurture debate. And spoiler alert for the listeners, it's both.
It is definitely both.
But it's how they interact that is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Let's start with the genetic baseline, the nature part of the equation.
The publications on MBT list specific hereditary biological factors. And we have to start by completely neutralizing the moral judgment here and recognize that human beings are simply born with different biological baseline settings in their central nervous systems.
It's just biology.
Right. This isn't a character flaw. It's biological diversity, much like height or eye color. The text highlights 3 highly specific genetic baselines that act as the ingredients.
Let's take them one by one. Ingredient number 1.
First is how sensitive an individual is to anxiety. This is the reactivity of the brain's threat detection system, primarily the amygdala. Think of it like a car alarm.
Okay, car alarm.
Some babies are born with a car alarm that only goes off if someone smashes the windshield with a brick. Their amygdala is highly unreactive. They can sleep through a vacuum cleaner. They aren't easily startled. Other babies are born with a car alarm that goes off if a leaf blows past the tire.
Oh, wow. Just highly, highly sensitive.
Exactly. They startle and cry at the drop of a pin, a change in lighting, a slight shift in a parent's tone of voice. Their nervous system is genetically wired to perceive threat everywhere.
I can completely see that. You look at a room full of toddlers, and it is instantly obvious who has the sensitive alarm system and who doesn't. Okay, ingredient number 2 is the baseline need for new stimuli.
Yes. This relates to the brain's dopamine system. How much novelty, how much input does the brain require to reach a baseline feeling of satisfaction or normalcy? Some children are perfectly content sitting quietly in a corner with a single wooden puzzle for 3 hours.
Right, very easily entertained.
Their brain is adequately stimulated by very little. Others have a neurological, physical craving for constant movement, loud noises, bright colors, and intense interpersonal interaction just to feel like they exist. If they are put in a quiet room, their brain feels understimulated, which actually feels like panic to them.
So we have the sensitivity of the alarm system and the hunger for stimulation. What is the third genetic factor mentioned in the framework?
The third is the baseline level of self-control or impulsivity. This is the innate strength of that prefrontal cortex we keep mentioning. It is the biological pause button between feeling an impulse and acting on it.
The pause button. I like that.
We all know people, even as adults, who naturally have a massive 5-second pause button. They feel angry, they pause, they evaluate the consequences, and then they speak. And we know others who simply do not possess that pause button. They feel the anger, and before they have even cognitively registered the emotion, they have thrown a glass at the wall. The action and the impulse are simultaneous.
So you have this genetic baseline. You are dealt a specific biological hand of cards at birth regarding your anxiety sensitivity, your need for stimulation, and your innate self-control. But that alone doesn't create a personality disorder, right? Because I know plenty of highly sensitive, impulsive people who are just like artists or entrepreneurs. They don't have a clinical disorder.
That's exactly right. The genetic baseline only sets the stage. It creates a vulnerability or a predisposition. This brings us to the second critical half of the equation, the environmental impact during development, the nurture aspect.
The environment.
The text specifically highlights negative environmental factors during childhood, primarily severe problems with attachment and growing up in an unsafe environment.
Right, we talked heavily about attachment in the previous deep dive on Section 6. So we know that if a child does not have a caregiver who makes them feel safe, seen, and soothed, if the parent is absent, abusive, highly unpredictable, or emotionally vacant, the child never learns how to regulate their own nervous system.
No, they don't. They can't.
Their internal alarm system, regardless of its genetic baseline, gets jammed in the on position.
Exactly. The environment fails to provide the software update the brain needs to manage its hardware. Now, what's truly fascinating here is the interaction between the two. It is the violent collision of the genetic baseline and the environmental stressors that actually creates the personality disorder.
There's a specific term for that in the framework, right?
Yes. The clinical framework in the publications on MBT refers to this as the whistleworking, a Dutch term that translates roughly to the dynamic interplay or the continuous reciprocal interaction.
Let me try to visualize this whistle working for you, the listener, because I want to make sure the mechanics are crystal clear. Let's say you have two kids. Kid A is born with a very calm, resilient genetic baseline, extremely low anxiety sensitivity, low need for chaotic stimulation, and high innate self-control. Kid B is born with a highly reactive baseline, massive anxiety sensitivity, high need for stimuli, and zero biological pause button. If both of these kids grow up in a healthy, safe, deeply loving, securely attached environment, Kid A might grow up to be a calm, steady accountant. Kid B, because they were taught how to manage their big feelings by loving parents, might channel that need for stimuli into becoming a passionate, slightly dramatic theater actor or an ER doctor. Both are healthy, functional adults. No disorders.
A perfect illustration of how traits are just traits. The loving environment provided the scaffolding for Kid B to learn how to manage their intense hardware.
But let's run the simulation again. If both of those kids are placed into a highly abusive, chaotic, unloving, terrifying environment, well, Kid A with a calm baseline is going to suffer. They might develop complex trauma. They might battle severe depression or anxiety, but their fundamental personality structure, their sense of self, might hold together because their biological alarm system wasn't constantly overloading.
Right, their baseline protected them somewhat.
But Kid B's highly sensitive, hyper-reactive genetic wiring is constantly being electrocuted by the unsafe environment. They don't have the biological self-control to manage the intense daily terror. So their developing brain starts frantically wiring together extreme, desperate, rigid coping mechanisms just to survive to adulthood.
And that whistle working, that highly specific, tragic interaction between a sensitive nervous system and a traumatizing environment determines which specific personality traits come to the foreground and become maladaptive. It defines the specific type of personality disorder someone might develop. The unsafe environment forces the genetic vulnerabilities to adapt in extreme, ultimately damaging ways.
Which brings us to the absolute centerpiece of Session 7. We are pivoting now to look specifically at one of the most talked about, most feared, yet profoundly misunderstood outcomes of that exact nature-nurture collision, borderline personality disorder, or BPD?
It is absolutely vital that we deconstruct BPD carefully, step by step, because the societal stigma surrounding it is immense and often causes more harm than the traits themselves. And we must start by reiterating and heavily emphasizing the critical phrase from the publications on MBT. De borderliner, the archetypal borderline person does not exist.
I love that they put that so bluntly in the text. The borderliner does not exist. Because when the average person hears the letters DPD, they immediately picture a very specific cinematic stereotype.
Oh, yes.
They picture a highly volatile, manipulative, dangerous person screaming in a movie, boiling a bunny on a stove, ruining everyone's life around them on purpose.
And that cinematic stereotype does a profound, tragic disservice to the complex reality of the diagnosis. The framework explains that not everyone with BPD experiences the same traits. Let's look at the math of the diagnosis. There are 9 clinical criteria, and a person only needs to meet 5 of them to receive the diagnosis.
Wait, let me do the math on that. If there are 9 criteria and you only need 5, that means there are over 250 different combinations of traits that could result in a BPD diagnosis.
Precisely. 256 combinations, to be exact. So 2 people can walk out of a psychiatrist's office with the exact same diagnosis of BPD, and they might only share one single trait in common.
That is wild.
Furthermore, people experience these traits at wildly different intensities. One person's fear of abandonment might look like quiet internal panic, while another's looks like screaming in a driveway. And crucially, they often have overlapping traits from other personality disorders, maybe some narcissistic traits covering up the insecurity, or dependent traits or avoidant traits where they hide from the world entirely. It is a highly complex, highly individualized spectrum of suffering.
So the old saying is absolutely true here. If you've met one person with BPD, you've met exactly one person with BPD. You cannot generalize. Okay, so with that massive caveat in place, let's walk through these specific traits as outlined in the publications on MBT. And instead of just listing them off like a textbook, let's try to weave them together to see how one triggers the other. Let's start with the relational chaos. The text outlines a specific trait regarding intense and unstable relationships. It describes a wild pendulum swing between thinking another person is absolutely amazing, a perfect savior, to suddenly thinking they are entirely worthless and evil.
In clinical and therapeutic terms, this mechanism is often called splitting or black and white thinking. And we have to look at the cognitive why behind it. Because the individual's emotional regulation system is so overwhelmed, the brain simply lacks the bandwidth to hold nuance.
Nuance is hard.
Nuance requires a calm prefrontal cortex. It is very, very difficult for a brain under severe distress to understand that a partner can be a fundamentally good, loving person who just made a careless mistake. If the partner makes a mistake, say, they forget to buy milk, the BPD brain, primed for threat, interprets it as a total intentional betrayal. The brain splits the partner from all good to all bad to protect itself from the perceived threat.
It's like the dimmer switch in the room is completely broken, and you only have an aggressive on-off switch. You're either the absolute savior of their universe, bathed in golden light, or you are the absolute villain, bathed in red light. There's no gray area.
Not at all.
Now, that sounds confusing and exhausting for the partner, but my God, I want to imagine how exhausting it is for the person experiencing it to genuinely, truly believe that your most trusted loved ones are constantly turning into monsters.
It is a terrifying way to live. You are constantly surrounded by potential betrayers, which connects directly and causally to another major trait outlined in the text, the profound fear of abandonment. The framework describes this as having tremendous difficulty being alone or being constantly, pervasively, obsessively afraid of being abandoned by the people you are attached to.
Now, I want to clarify this because I think everyone listening has a little fear of abandonment. Nobody likes being dumped. Nobody likes feeling left out. But this is clinically different, right? Let's give a real-world visceral example. Say you send a text message to your romantic partner. Hey, how's your day going? 5 minutes pass. No response. 10 minutes pass. 15 minutes. For someone without this trait, what happens? They think, oh, they're probably in a meeting, or they left their phone in the car. They go back to drinking their coffee. But for someone with this severe BPD trait, what is happening biologically and psychologically during minute 16?
At minute 16, the internal alarm system, that hyperreactive amygdala we discussed, goes off at full volume. The cognitive thought isn't, they're busy. The thought, driven by that whistle working of genetics and childhood trauma, is absolute. They are deliberately ignoring me. They have finally realized I am worthless, They are packing their bags. They are leaving me forever. I am going to be entirely alone in the world.
It escalates so quickly.
It's instantaneous. And the most important thing for you to understand is that the psychological pain of that perceived abandonment is indistinguishable from physical agony. The brain processes social rejection in the exact same neural pathways as physical pain. They are experiencing the equivalent of touching a hot stove just because a text message wasn't answered.
And the text points out what happens next, which is where the behavior becomes visible to the outside world. It says this intense fear leads to desperate attempts to prevent that abandonment. This could look like putting up with absolutely anything from a partner, even severe physical or emotional abuse, just to keep a warm body in the room. Or it looks like acting out dramatically, calling them 40 times in an hour, begging, crying, or threatening to ruin their life if they leave.
And right here is where the societal misunderstanding is most tragic and where the stigma is born. When a partner calls 40 times or makes a threat because they think they are being left, society immediately slaps the label of manipulation on them. We view it as a calculated, malicious plot to control the other person.
Right, like they're a mastermind.
But if we look at the underlying mechanism, it is not calculated at all. It is a severe, unregulated survival response to perceived relational terror. Imagine a person drowning in the ocean. If a lifeguard swims out to save them, the drowning person will often thrash wildly, clawing at the lifeguard, sometimes even pushing the lifeguard underwater to get a breath of air. Oh, wow. It is incredibly dangerous for the rescuer, yes. But the drowning person isn't doing it out of malice. The intent is pure, desperate survival.
A survival response to relational terror.
Yeah.
That is such a powerful paradigm-shifting reframing. It completely changes how you look at the behavior. You don't excuse the behavior because pulling the lifeguard under is still dangerous, but you stop viewing the drowning person as an evil mastermind.
Exactly.
Okay, so that is the relational chaos. Let's move deeper into the individual's mind. What I'm calling the internal storm. Deconstructing BPD Part 2. Another major trait in the framework is identity problems. It's described as having strongly shifting ideas about who you are and what you find important in life.
Identity is usually anchored by a stable internal sense of self, which is built over time through secure attachments and consistent emotional regulation. But if your internal world is a hurricane of extreme emotions and your relationships are constantly flipping between idealization and devaluation, it becomes nearly impossible to build a solid, concrete foundation of self. You are a house built on sand in an earthquake zone.
I remember in high school, I went through intense phases where I would change my entire style every month trying to figure out who I was. One month, I was a skater wearing baggy clothes. The next month, I was a brooding theater kid reading poetry. But the framework is describing something much more pervasive and destabilizing than teenage exploration, right?
Yes, take that teenage search for identity, multiply the intensity and the stakes by 100, and apply it to an adult's core values, their career choices, their sexual orientation, their political beliefs, and their fundamental moral compass. It creates a deeply disorienting, frightening internal experience.
Like you don't even know yourself.
A person with severe identity diffusion might wake up genuinely feeling like a completely different person than they were the week before. To cope with this, they often adopt the identities of the people around them just to feel grounded. If they date a musician, they suddenly become obsessed with music and change their entire wardrobe. If they date an athlete, they suddenly care deeply about fitness. They are desperately trying on different skins because their own skin feels entirely transparent.
Which makes total heartbreaking sense when you connect it to the next trait outlined in the text, the void. The framework describes it simply as a pervasive feeling of emptiness inside. But from everything we've just discussed, this isn't just feeling a little bored on a Sunday afternoon.
Not at all. It is described by patients in clinical settings as a profound, chronic, almost physical sensation of nothingness, a literal black hole in the center of the chest. When you do not have a stable identity to anchor you, and your relationships feel constantly precarious and threatening, the default resting state of your nervous system is this agonizing, echoing emptiness. It is a feeling of being a ghost in your own life.
And as the saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. So the human brain will do absolutely anything it can to fill that void, which drives so much of the chaotic behavior we see. If you feel entirely, terrifyingly empty, maybe starting a massive screaming argument with your spouse will at least make you feel something.
Yeah.
Anger is better than the void. Adrenaline is better than the void.
Precisely. The void drives the storm. The chaos is a frantic attempt to feel alive.
And speaking of the storm, that leads us directly into the trait of extreme mood swings. The text notes that individuals can experience violently shifting emotions within a very short time. For example, being deeply suicidally desperate one moment, and then in a cheering, joyful, ecstatic mood on the exact same day, or sometimes within a single hour.
This is a hallmark of the emotional regulation difficulties we discussed at the very beginning, the glitchy app. Now, we must differentiate this from bipolar disorder, which is a common misdiagnosis.
Well, that's a really important distinction.
Very important. In bipolar disorder, mood episodes, mania, or depression typically last for weeks or even months at a time, and they are often independent of what is happening in the environment. In BPD, this is emotional whiplash, and it is highly reactive to the environment. The trigger might be incredibly small to an outsider, a perceived slight tone in an email, a sudden change in dinner plans, and the emotional response is immediate, absolute, and all-consuming.
I'm just putting myself in those shoes for a second. I want you to try and imagine the sheer caloric biological exhaustion of that existence. To cry tears of profound chest-heaving grief at 10 a.m. because you thought your friend ignored you. To feel completely normal, happy, and validated at 10:30 a.m. because they texted back, and then to feel overwhelming, blood-boiling rage by 11:15 a.m. because you dropped your coffee. Your central nervous system is running a marathon every single morning. You would be physically exhausted by lunch.
You would be profoundly depleted. And that rage you just mentioned is another specific trait outlined in the framework, anger outbursts that are incredibly intense and notoriously difficult to control.
Going back to our smartphone analogy, this is where the emotional regulation app doesn't just crash and freeze the screen. It causes the phone to overheat so severely that it burns the hand of the person holding it.
That's a very accurate extension of the analogy. The anger is often explosive, caustic, and highly disproportionate to the actual situation. But what is absolutely vital to understand, and what the people on the receiving end of that anger rarely get to see, is the immediate aftermath.
What happens then?
After the anger outburst, when the cortisol burns off and the baseline returns, the individual is usually flooded with immense, crushing shame and guilt for how they acted. And what does that shame do? It feeds right back into the negative self-image, which feeds the feelings of worthlessness, which feeds the terrifying void, which starts the entire cycle all over again.
It's a brutal, self-contained loop. You punish yourself for your own symptoms. And that leads us to the final section of our deconstruction of VPD extreme coping and breaking points. Because when the internal pain, the shame, the anger, the fear of abandonment, the void gets to be too much for the human brain to process, the behaviors turn outward in desperate, dangerous ways. The text highlights impulsivity as a major trait. It notes this can cause the individual to get into serious financial, legal, or physical trouble, or put others in danger. We are talking about reckless driving, binge eating, extreme spending sprees, substance abuse, or highly unsafe sexual encounters.
Again, we have to look past the surface behavior and look at the function of the behavior. If you are trying to outrun a chronic feeling of emptiness that feels like it's eating you alive, or if you're trying to distract yourself from the immediate terror of perceived abandonment, a massive sudden hit of adrenaline or dopamine from a highly impulsive act serves a very specific purpose.
It's functional for them.
Yes. It acts as a temporary, powerful anesthetic. It numbs the pain of the void for a few fleeting moments.
And that concept of a behavioral anesthetic is absolutely crucial for understanding the next trait, which is perhaps the most heavily stigmatized of all self-destructive behavior. The text specifically mentions self-mutilation, cutting, burning, or suicide attempts. And here's where I really need your expert insight, because the framework offers a very specific explanation for this that I think society completely dangerously misses.
This is perhaps the most urgent, life-saving reframing we can offer in this entire deep dive. Society, and even poorly trained medical professionals, often dismiss self-harm in BPD as manipulative attention-seeking. The publications on MBT explicitly, categorically state that these actions are most often a method of coping with incredibly intense, overwhelming feelings that the brain simply cannot process.
So when we talk about a suicide attempt or self-harm in this specific context, it's not necessarily about a desire to stop living.
Often, it is not about wanting to die at all. It is about needing the unbearable psychological pain to stop and having no other tools to stop it. When the emotional pain reaches a threshold that the brain literally cannot process, when the hardware is completely overloaded, inflicting physical pain actually does two very specific biological things.
What does it do?
First, the injury causes the brain to flood the body with endorphins, which are the body's natural painkillers. This sudden rush of endorphins temporarily soothes the emotional agony, creating a brief sense of calm. Second, it utilizes the gate control theory of pain. Physical pain is concrete. You can see the cut, you can point to the burn. It makes logical sense to the brain.
Right, compared to the emotional pain.
Exactly. Emotional pain, the void, the terror of abandonment that is invisible, boundless, and incomprehensible. By creating a physical wound, the individual translates an unbearable, invisible pain into a manageable physical pain. Understanding the function of this behavior, that it is a desperate biological attempt to self-medicate and manage pain, is absolutely vital for anyone trying to offer empathy, support, or clinical treatment.
It's a pressure valve, a dangerous, tragic, heartbreaking pressure valve, but a functionally effective one in the immediate, desperate moment. That fundamentally changes how you respond to someone in a crisis. If you view it as manipulation, you respond with anger and punishment. If you view it as a pressure valve, you don't judge the valve. You sit with them in the pain and you help them find a safer, non-lethal way to release the steam.
Exactly. Empathy begins when judgment ends.
Okay, we have reached the final trait outlined in the framework, trait 9. What happens when the stress reaches the absolute maximum breaking point? The pressure valve didn't work, the impulsive anesthetic wore off, the abandonment feels certain. The text describes this breaking point as experiencing transient paranoid thoughts or severe dissociation.
When the stress is too high and all other coping mechanisms have failed, the central nervous system starts systematically shutting down its connection to reality to protect the core organism. Paranoia manifests as the brain becoming highly suspicious of everything, looking for hidden malicious meanings behind completely benign actions. The brain is trying to predict the threat so it can survive it.
And dissociation. I hear that word thrown around a lot on social media, but what is the clinical reality of severe dissociation in BPD?
Dissociation is the brain's ultimate final circuit breaker. The text describes it as feeling like you are standing entirely outside of yourself, observing your body from across the room, or feeling that the world around you is no longer real, like you are walking through a movie set or a dream. Going back to your smartphone analogy, the hardware of your phone is so violently overheated from the crashing apps that the screen just goes completely black to protect the motherboard from melting.
It just shuts down.
The individual detaches from their physical body, their memories, and their surroundings because reality itself has become too objectively painful to inhabit. It is the ultimate escape when physical escape is impossible.
Wow. When you lay all 9 of these traits out, one by one, and you connect them, well, when you explain the why behind them, the biology of the whistle working, the cortisol floods, the endorphin responses, the manipulation, the anger, the impulsivity, it all completely stops looking like a disordered bad person who just wants to cause chaos. It starts looking like an incredibly resilient human being who is fighting a brutal, daily, exhausting war inside their own nervous system just to survive until bedtime.
That realization, that profound shift in perspective from judgment to understanding, is the exact foundational goal that mentalization-based treatment aims to achieve. You cannot heal what you are constantly judging.
So how do we take all of this heavy, deep psychological theory and apply it? For you listening, whether you recognize some of these specific traits in yourself today, or whether this helped you suddenly understand the baffling behavior of someone you deeply love, the publications on MBT actually give us a practical application to end on. A piece of homework. The text says, write down this week which personality traits you personally suffered from the most over the past week.
And my advice for you as you sit down to do this homework is to approach it with the mindset of a compassionate scientist. Approach it with absolute curiosity and absolutely zero judgment. You are not a prosecutor building a criminal case against yourself to prove how broken you are. You are a researcher calmly collecting data.
You are just looking at the phone, checking the battery usage, and noting which specific apps crashed this week. The emotional regulation app crashed on Tuesday when my boss emailed me. The relationship app crashed on Thursday when my partner was late.
Precisely. The goal is entirely divorced from self-criticism. Recognizing, naming, and tracking the specific traits, the specific crashing apps, is the very first non-negotiable step toward the effective code rewriting treatment we discussed earlier. You cannot rewrite the corrupted code until you calmly identify which app is malfunctioning.
I love that framing. Data collection, not self-condemnation. As we wrap up this incredibly intense deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder. Something to chew on over the next few days as you reflect on the people in your life. If everything we've talked about today is true, if our most difficult, frustrating, destructive personality traits are actually born from a complex whistle working, a tragic mixture of the natural neurological wiring we didn't choose, and an environment's failure to make us feel safe when we were vulnerable children, how might we view our own flaws moving forward? And how might we view the flaws of those we love, or even those who deeply frustrate us? If we actively choose to replace blame with compassion, and if we replace judgment with a genuine desire to understand the underlying pain driving the behavior, how would that change the way we interact with the world tomorrow morning?
It is a profound, world-changing question, and really, it is the core philosophy of mentalizing itself.
In the next episode, we will continue with Session 8, titled Mentalization-Based Treatment. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to follow us to stay up to date with our latest episodes.